So much like a painting, composition has organization. A spatial composition has organization. So, and when we talk about organization in space, we want to talk about two different spatial main types. So basically, one being spatial hierarchy, and two being organizational rules. So when you talk about hierarchy and how it pertains to a level structure, there's a couple of ways you can think about it. One being sort of the level flow, breaking down sort of like different sections of the level. And we typically do this in a from a production standpoint, talking about like different sections and how those different sections break down. So in this particular example, I have a forest path that would probably include some side sections to it as well. A forest temple that sort of has different areas within it. So this is an example of a hierarchy with level flow. And you see within sort of this mountain temple example over here, we see sort of represented a different type of hierarchy, one similar to how we were looking at in the flow chart for the cluster just a few moments ago. So how spaces relate to one another. When several spaces are connected, there can exist a clear pattern of dominance, creating a hierarchical pattern. So when we talk about two spaces that are related to one another, there are a lot of different ways that they can have a relationship. They can be adjacent, and they can be adjacent in a number of different ways. They could be completely separate like this, and it's hard to say they really have a relationship if there's not a connection. They could seem like they're one space and they have a sort of a divider between them, and it's creating sort of a two different spaces. Have a doorway between them. You have quite a lot of variety. You could sort of have spaces that sort of bleed one another. So the I guess the actual difference between being in one space versus another is kind of ambiguous. You can also divide spaces using verticalities. So in a case like this, we have one large room, but because part of the room is slightly elevated, it divides it into a separate space. And what's interesting in this case is that, as we sort of elevate, it sort of, we'll go back down to that, kind of demonstrates that the space on the left and the space on the right, that space on the right sort of feels like it's almost kind of a subsection of the space on the left. And that's because a number of different reasons, but for one thing, it feels like the space on the right is smaller. It feels like the space on the left sort of connects and flows into this sort of space. It feels a little different if we were to sort of divide it like this, where now there's actually not a connection that we can see along the wall. It feels very much like there's sort of two different spaces. So spaces can also appear one space within another. And when it is, there's sort of a clear hierarchy of dominance here. Obviously, there's one room outside that's sort of containing the other, so that's the sort of a very dominant sort of structure. The smaller space sort of depends on the shape of the exterior space. And if we were to do an example of a room here in the middle of a larger room, this is just a quick study showing how the size of the dependent space, as we sort of bring it larger and larger, it sort of erases the sort of apparent relationship of a dominant structure and with a smaller structure within it. And this right here starts to feel more like a hallway around a room, less of a sort of dominant dependent relationship. That's less of a problem here, where it feels like the ceiling is raised, demonstrating a clear lack of dependency of the larger space on the smaller, so the larger space is something of its own. So even if you sort of make it even larger like this, you can see as the clearness of the sort of the dominance of the larger space. So another way that spaces can interact is by interlocking. So here we have two rectangular spaces, and when they're brought together, so they overlap, we end up with a contested space between them. And essentially this contested space sort of could be shared by the two spaces. It could belong to one of the other, or we could shift the higher as we sort of shift like who actually owns this this space. The hierarchical dominance of one space to the other sort of shifts. So as the interlocking space belongs to the bottom right, we end up with a dominant space in the bottom right and a subordinate space in the top left. But as we shift to the other, that sort of dominance shifts. Or it could just be a singular space in the middle that has its own. So this is ambiguous about like which space is actually the dominance. So next case, spaces can be connected by a common space. Maybe this is a hallway type space like circulation. We could stretch this out. Or maybe we have three equal spaces, but then again, like looking at this example right here, they're really not completely equal. The middle space has more utility. The spaces on the sides are dependent on their relationship with the middle space, making the middle space the dominant space. Let's see. So in this case right here, we have a space that sort of is created by the sort of negative space between, or I'm sorry, the positive space between two spaces. And in this case, here's another case where the smaller space is created by the placement of the these outside room figures, which leads to another factor that can come in dominance, and that is negative spaces versus positive space. Negative spaces tends to be ambiguous in size because it doesn't have so much sort of things confining them. It's more sort of ambiguous in nature of where the boundaries are, so there's more possibility, and it tends to make a space that is a more dominant space than positive spaces around it. Dominance can also be enhanced by a size differential. So when you have sort of a large space in the middle, it feels like the main focus of the space, and these spaces on the sides are satellite spaces. And this can be sort of enhanced by adding even more spaces. So the more spaces that are sort of dependent on this large space, the more it sort of reinforces the central space as the focus of this cluster. It has the most weight, which is another word for dominance if we want to bring it back to how composition works. Spaces can be contained within a common space. So two spaces can be related by the fact that they're enclosed in a common space, which of course is very similar to sort of a space within a space. But here there's not really any sort of dominance relationship between one space versus another, aside from the sort of enclosing spaces. So to